Well, thank you for joining me for my first time here on the Travelog Network, and it's an honor to be here. The purpose of me being here is because I was invited to share a show here on the Travelog, and so that's why I'm here. I've been through all the training and everything that takes place, and quite honestly, it's a joy. I do my show, the Outlaw Pulpit, on other network as well, but when I was asked to be a part of this, I was certainly honored and certainly blessed to be in this area. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've been through quite a bit, and I will talk in length about who I am and what this new show is all about. Why the Outlaw Pulpit? What's the purpose of this show? And I hope that for those of you that are in the church, okay, and when I say church, I realize there are a lot of different definitions of the church. Let me share with you a special story once. In 2010, possibly 2011, I kind of get the years blurred there. During Cornerstone Festival, a lot of you've been to Cornerstone. There was a evening where they celebrated the what would you say, the Jesus movement era. And it was at that time that I was specifically asked to teach a track at Cornerstone for the Northern Seminary College. Now, Northern Seminary. Now, they would have a separate tract over under a tent, and it said Northern Seminary. And what they brought me in to do was to talk about surviving church and spiritual abuse. And it was a joy. I did that for about 4 years. And I also taught this track at Life Fest here in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Now, I'm based in Waupaca, Wisconsin, which, if you look on a map, you go 2 hours north, and you'll find a little city called Waupaca. We're in between Stevens Point, which is a college town, home of one of our University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. And to the right of us, an hour, is home of the one and only Green Bay Packers. Yes, the city of Green Bay. So that's where I'm at. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, but transplanted up to Waupaca in 2004. And I'm going to share about all of that through this Travelog channel, the Outlaw Pulpit. Now, what you're going to find out about me is that I'm a straight shooter, and so I just share what's on my mind. as a few others do on this channel as well. I think of Alan and what a dear friend he is. And so, that's what I'm here for. So, but I was at Cornerstone, and one of the cool things about being at Cornerstone is that I stayed at the hotel where they put up all the guest speakers and bands and stuff like that. One of my most special times that I had there was during breakfast at the hotel. I'm sitting there getting a drink, my apple juice, a muffin, things like that. And I'm standing next to this old guy, and I look at him. He looks at me. I look away. You know how that goes. You don't want people to think you're a creep by staring at them. And so I look at them, and I begin to wonder just a little bit, like, okay, so who is this guy? He looks very familiar. And finally I said, excuse me, sir, I just got to ask, are you Barry McGuire? And he said, yes, I am. I am Barry McGuire. And he asked what my name was. And he was so interested in what I was doing. And I'm like, I'm in like music greatness presence here. And I'm next to Barry McGuire. Of course, he wrote the popular song, which was a crossover during that time, called The Eve of Destruction. And so you can YouTube that song or whatever. But if you're a kid raised in church, you also knew one of his child songs called Bullfrogs and Butterflies. You know, bullfrogs and butterflies, they've both been born again. And we got talking quite a bit about church. And I said, so Barry, if you don't mind me asking you, what church do you belong to? What fellowship do you belong to? Denomination, whatever the case may be. He says, well, Bob, I belong to the Church of Two or Three. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Okay, I haven't heard of that. And being a little more naive at the time, I said, where is that located? And he just laughed. He goes, no, the scripture says where two or three are gathered. God says where two or three are gathered, there in the midst of them I am. And so he goes, I'm fed up with church. I'm fed up with institutional church. I'm fed up with brick and mortar churchianity. It's become something that it shouldn't have become. And I get that. I totally totally get that. And yet here I am, a credentialed minister with the Assemblies of God. If you don't believe me, here is my fellowship card. You ever seen one of these before? Um, it basically is I'm licensed as a pastor through the Assemblies of God. And that is my upbringing. My grandma started the church that she raised my mom in. She helped start the church. She was what was called, churches really don't use this term these days, a charter member. And that was the church she raised my mother in. Well, ultimately, that's the church where my dad met her. And so he jumped ship. He was Presbyterian and decided to become Assemblies of God, the calling of the Lord. Actually, it was a woman, my mom, that he ended up coming over to that. And then that was the same church my parents raised us in. And quite honestly, I can say it was a good experience. It really was. But it hasn't been that way for me in my time in the church. And so during this chat, I'm live right now here in Wapaka from my bunker in the house. And I got Robbie the robot right here watching over my shoulder. But it hasn't always been that way for me. I was raised in the church and then ultimately was asked to be the youth pastor of an Assembly of God church in the south side of Milwaukee called Bayview, which is the greater Milwaukee area. Well, I was there 8 years as their youth pastor, and it went very well, very well, too well. Now, how can I say something went too well in ministry? Well, I'll expound on that in a little bit. But those of you that are watching on YouTube or my Facebook page, the Outlaw Pulpit, or on the Travelogue Facebook page, feel free to comment. I can see them right here, and I will answer your questions as we go along. This will be the format that we're going to roll with each week, each Wednesday at 1 o'clock Central Time. And if you want, feel free to let me know where you're from. I would love to recognize and connect with you. So for the first few weeks at this church that I was hired on, and I didn't apply. I was a DJ of a Christian skate night where the skate rink ultimately wanted me to play Christian music for their Wednesday night skate every week. I was no longer there with my youth pastor just to rent the skate area once a month on a Saturday night. They asked me to come back because I was playing tunes. Now, granted, during that time, the big popular CCM stuff was Carmen and oh man, Caedmon's Call, stuff like that. I'm not slamming that one way or the other, but I took a little bit of a different approach. I was more into Dataphobia, Dance House Children, Joe Electric, Prodigal Sons, stuff like that. And that's the music I was playing. And we had quite a constituency of Black gospel churches coming. So I would dive into early John P. Key, the first album from Kirk Franklin, and Winan, stuff like that. So it was a little different a little bit of a different skate night, but stuff with a groove that you could go to, remember John Gibson, stuff like that. Scott Blackwell, I'd mix his stuff in there as well. And there was a church that came up, Bayview Assembly of God, and the pastor said, I'm the new pastor there and we don't have a youth pastor. Have you considered going into youth ministry? And I said, well, oddly enough, I am in school right now to pursue it. It's for personal enrichment. But he said, well, would you be open to being our youth pastor at the church? So I prayed about it a little bit and I took it and it went very well. It was a church of about 80 people. And in no time, our youth group grew from 12 kids to about 85 kids weekly on Wednesday nights. Tuesday nights. And it was going very well. Now, this is where I say it went too well. And I'm telling you my story because we're going to be seeing each other every week. And so I want you to be able to get to know me a little bit. When I say too well, there is a thing in church called ministry jealousy that takes place. And this was happening unbeknownst to me. I grew up in a church that was the picture of stability, the picture of what a typical church would look like. And so when I got pulled into the office, this was about year 6.5, 7. We grew to a youth group to about 85 in a church of about now 70. And then the kids, I realized they're not leaving, and they don't go to adult service. They don't show up on Sundays, but they come to youth group. And it gets a little weird when you're 19, 20 years old in a youth group with teenagers and 13-year-olds and stuff like that. So I began a college ministry. It was called Brazen. Yes, it was a majestic logo. It was all of these things that that reeked of the 90s and early 2000s. So we started Brazen, and that thing took off. Now we have 25 kids, college students in Brazen, and 85 kids in the youth group. And that is when everything started falling apart for me. Not due to moral failure or anything like that, but I was never invited to a board meeting over those years that I was there as a youth pastor until year 6.5, maybe 7. When I say the TBN mentality set in, we had a cool little church. It was a great little place just outside of the inner city of Milwaukee, very groovy place to be. And the pastor decided that we heard headlines that the Catholic Church was merging churches in the south side of Milwaukee in order to take care of debt and stuff like that. And the Catholic Church was shrinking. And so he had this bright idea to buy this majestic, huge building with 70 people, mind you, maybe 60. And there wasn't a bank at all that would finance that, because a $1.5 million mortgage with 70 people at best, you do the math. Well, the archdiocese said, we will fund you. We will write the loan for you, and you can have the building. And that was it. And we ended up moving in this big building, and within no time, we were in debt. We were in massive debt. In fact, we were falling behind on our payments because of this TBN mentality that trickled in. And quite honestly, it really it rubbed me the wrong way the whole time. But at the same time, I was simply the youth pastor, associate pastor at times. And they pulled me in and said, Bob, here's the deal. They said, you are going to fall under our guidelines. Now, in Milwaukee, the youth group met on Tuesday nights because Wednesday night was sports night for the schools. They didn't care. They wanted me on Wednesday nights. So they moved me to Wednesday nights, and the youth group plummeted. Within 2 weeks, we were back at about 20 kids or so. And so that sent me into like survival mode for the youth ministry, and thought, let's try new things. Let's get some stuff going here, and do things we haven't done. You know, the old cliche, to get people you've never had, you have to do things you've never done. And so we began hosting hip hop festivals. I realize all of us come from different walks of life, and we've all listened to different Christian music. But for specifically, I brought in a group called LA Symphony. They with Pigeon John, and they did a hip hop show. It was great, good turnout. We got a couple kids from that. Well, then I'm like, well, what if we do a big blowout hip hop festival, b-boy battle, that's breakdancing, stuff like that. Let's see what. Now, I'm a metalhead at heart, but I do enjoy the hip hop scene. So we brought in Sackcloth Fashion, Man of War, Luke Garrity, Mars Ill, all these groups. And then these groups in the city heard about this, and so the b-boy battle was huge. I mean, during the show, there was a b-boy battle, breakdance battle, and it was like on top notch. Well, what happened was, during this show, because we're doing outreach and we were in this new building, a group of kids from different, I don't know, gangs or whatever, decided to tag up the whole every bathroom in the building, spray paint. And it was, to be honest with you, it was awesome. It was totally awesome. And but it was shortly after, it was the day after that event, and I was in the bathrooms getting the paint off. You know, they make industrial stuff that you can do that. And the pastor walked in and he goes, "What does that smell?" And he was ticked. He was hot. And I said, "Well, it's just turpentine, mineral spirit, stuff like that. I'm getting it off." He goes, and he goes, "That smell though is just awful." I go, "That's actually," and I didn't know he was getting mad at me. And I said, "Well, that's the smell of ministry." And he that night they had a board meeting. They pulled me in, And they said, you are no longer allowed to do an event like that. They had that conversation with me once before. In the early years of being a youth pastor, I was a music buyer for a Christian bookstore, a very successful one, a very successful Christian bookstore. And we get artists in once in a while. And one group walked in, long hair, stuff like that. And they said, man, the place we were playing at in Milwaukee and I pulled out. Do you have any place for us to go? And I said, well, I'm a youth pastor in tonight's youth group. You're welcome to come and we'll give you gas money and send you on your way. So that night, we introduced the youth group to a very young disciple. It was a very good concert, very good time. But again, the next day, the pastor pulled me into his office. I get pulled into a lot of offices. I get in trouble. And he said, don't do that again. Okay. He just said, we're not going to do that again. So this was the same conversation. And it was really more of a shouting match, not between me. Every time I tried to speak, they just said, you will not talk until you are asked a question. And so that was it. I walked out of there. I went home and I was newly married. And I said, I think this is the beginning of the end for me here. I really think they don't get it. They don't. And so we basically started seeing things happen and they pulled the funding. Now, let me clarify about that. And again, feel free to comment. I would love to read your comments, post a few up on the screen here. If you have email, you can email me outlawpulpit@gmail.com. It's on the screen. Well, what happened there ultimately was that they pulled everything. They said, and granted, 7 years earlier, they said, what you raise is what your budget is. Okay. So whatever I raise is what my youth ministry budget is. I had my own checkbook and everything. So I got involved with the Milwaukee Brewers, Major League Baseball, and was selling concessions with our volunteer group. And we were pulling down $2,000-3,000 every 3 weeks or so. And we had a way, way larger budget than the church did. And when they asked me this, it was a time when they told me that they want the checkbook, they want everything, and I can just do youth ministry. They said, just do youth ministry. Well, there was about 15,000 or something like that. It was some big number in the checkbook. So I went out and the day after they told me that, I went out and just blew it all on stuff for the youth room. I bought brand new computers, monitors, sound system, everything. I'm like, there's no way this is going to happen. We're going to stack the youth room. And so while the church was still using transparencies, our youth room was stacked. We had big screen monitors and everything. And that didn't bode well with the powers that be, in case you were wondering. But, it was interesting because then I found out every week it was just a lashing. I kept getting lashed with verbal statements and things like that. And I was thinking to myself, there's something larger in the room going on here. Well, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, the pastor ended up having to resign due to moral failure. And you look back on that in the psyche of a person, and if their world's falling apart, they tend to lash out on people. And I was the whipping boy. I was the young youth pastor, and it all came out in the wash. But even after that, after he left, the board made it very difficult for me to stay on staff there. And a friend of mine from the Assemblies of God came to do what they call an uninstallation service, where they tell the church what happened, uninstall the pastor, and basically move on. And so I told the board, and I said, well, I would like to submit my resume, and I love this church and I love this city. And the guest speaker took me out that Sunday after church. Now, Tim Cruz here, I'll put up on the screen. He says, that sounds painfully familiar. And that's the thing, is that our stories, unfortunately, we wish that there wouldn't be many of these, but this really is the case in a lot of places. Now, ultimately, what happened here is that that guest speaker ended up pulling me out and took me out to dinner, took me out to lunch after service one Sunday, because he was the interim speaker then at the time. And he goes, where are you at? What are you thinking? What do you want to do? And I said, well, I put my resume in last week and would really enjoy being the pastor of this church. And He goes, Bob, let me shoot straight with you. And my friend Joel, a retired pastor, he shot straight with me. He goes, they don't want you here. And I was like, excuse me? He goes, they do not want you here. The leadership absolutely does not want you here. Do yourself a favor and pull your resume. Well, I ultimately, about 2 weeks later, it was really a unique timeline that God had set up for me during this time. And he, in short time, the pastor from the head honcho from the Assemblies of God, one of them, told me, said, Bob, I'm starting a new church in Wapaka. I'd love for you to be a part of it. Why don't you pray about it? So Tracy and I did, my wife and I did, and we drove up to Wapaka to check it out. And well, quite honestly, it was a good thing. So we had youth ministry. Again, it exploded. With God just giving us favor and ideas for youth group and everything. The youth group grew to about 70 in a church of about 20. And within a year and a half of accepting the position, that pastor got caught in a prostitution sting operation in the Milwaukee area. That sent me into a tizzy. That's like, okay, how many times are we going to do this? And I love being a youth pastor, but the powers that be at the Assemblies of God office, they said, Bob, we would love for you to pastor this church. And I was a train wreck at this point. This guy that left turned the church against me, said I kicked them out and everything. And it's like, no, your sin did. And the Assemblies of God pulled you out. And I was a train wreck. And so when the head guy, they call him the district superintendent, asked me to take the church, I said, you know what I think of the whole church model? And he said, what? I said, it can go to hell. I'm done. I'm tapping out. And he's a longtime friend of my family through ministerial stuff. And he goes, Bob, would you just reconsider that? And so I did. And that's where I've been since. The first service that I had, it wasn't a big pomp and circumstance installation service. It was literally one guy who was a friend of this pastor that had to leave. He walked in late for service. We had 8 people at this point in the building, and a mortgage. We owned the building. And he goes, I'm here on behalf of the Assemblies of God to introduce to you your new pastor. Here's Bob Adams. Not even Pastor Bob Adams. He just said Bob Adams. And he walked out the back door and was gone. And that began my career as the senior pastor of the church that I'm currently at. And so that's the kind of that's where I'm coming from on this entire podcast, is surviving church and spiritual abuse and talking about other hot topics within the church body. Okay, within the church. So honestly, you can email me right there. Whoop, there we go. outlawpulpit@gmail.com. And in weeks coming up, broadcasts coming up, I will address your comments. I will address your topics. I will always have a topic and a subject in which I'm going to go, but I would certainly always love to hear from you. Just like our friend Tim posted, that it sounded painfully familiar. Out of all of this hurt, I've written 2 books that are available on Amazon. One is basically a collection of blogs, and the other one is called Mutiny Aboard the gospel ship, the good old gospel ship. Now, it's a term used in Southern gospel music, referring to the church, the good old gospel ship. And I just decided to name that Mutiny Aboard the good old gospel ship. And it really just shares my story about how I view church and how I view these things. And I have my Facebook page, facebook.com/Outlaw Pulpit, where 1,300 other people are engaging in conversation and talking about church and surviving these things. But ultimately, that's where I was honored to speak at Cornerstone on this topic, because it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I love the church. I really do. And I agree with some people question if this quote was from St. Augustine or not, but it's attributed to him. So it says, and the quote is this: "The church is my mother, but she's still a whore." I think it goes the other way. The church is a whore, but she's still my mother. Either way, you get the gist of it. That it's a beautiful thing. What do I think of the New Testament church in the Bible? I believe it's the heartbeat of God. I really do. And that's why I haven't backed down. After 26 years of being in full-time vocational credentialed ministry, I still enjoy it. I told that pastor who asked me to take this church, I said, working with other people really sucks sometimes. It really is an awful experience at times. But here's one thing that's going to be constant. Two things. First, God is good, always has been, always will be. And ministry always remains a positive in the church life. And so that's where I'm coming from. And so I hope that you join me each week. You've gotten to know me quite a bit through this podcast. I feel like I just kind of had diarrhea of the mouth here and filled up 25 minutes like that. I will open it to more conversation next Wednesday and weeks to come as we begin rolling with this. But, I really enjoy doing these sort of things. So I realized that time is wrapping up. Wow, that went quick. D.E. Johnson says Cornerstone was more like church for us than, well, it ain't a building. Where did you hear that? Here's the comment there. And I agree with you. There was something very beautiful, something very special about Cornerstone that other festivals have just tried to replicate, and they're doing a fine job. They really are. I mean, there's audio feed and stuff like that, but there will never be another Cornerstone. And I get that. I told my wife the years that we were married early on, where she came with me to Cornerstone. I remember pulling in one night, late at night, being able to surpass the line because I was a guest speaker. Hallelujah. And I just pulled in and I said, we're home. It just felt like that. It felt like what church ought to be. Okay. Where you walk in and you're like, I am home. And so thank you, D.E. Johnson, for your comment. I really do appreciate that very much. And so here we are, the first full week here on Travelogue. And again, if you have an email, send it over. But also, I do have a website. It's outlawpulpit@gmail.com. I'm sorry, that's my email address. outlawpulpit.com. Very simple. And there you'll find archived footage of my previous teachings that I do in an abbreviated style, but also these will be posted there as well. So I'll hang out here for just a couple more minutes, see if anybody else wants to comment. We have 5 people watching, which is great. I came into this with no expectations other than knowing that it's an honor to be asked to be on another network like Travelogue. My friend Alan asked me to consider it, and I said, absolutely, I will. But this is always something that I enjoy doing and will continue to do. I have a blog site going as well. It's just called PastorBob'sConfessional.com, and you can read all of my rants and riffs and everything going back to all the way back to 2010. Am I proud of some of those posts that I put up because of the hurt that I experienced? Not necessarily. Would I consider pulling them for what I said? No. It's part of my story. I think we need to celebrate our past, and let those things build us into who we are today. And so I just leave them up, and you can feel free to navigate that all you want. So, well, looks like that's about it. But again, join me every Wednesday. I will be live. There might be an occasional time. There will be a time in June where I'm going to be on vacation. That'll be a recorded show. I'm going on the coolest vacation, by the way. We were going to go out of the country, but the country we were going to requires COVID shot, and we don't have that. That's for another podcast. So my wife said, why don't we do your dream road trip? And that is to drive the entire Route 66. So I'm going to be doing that in the first part of June. But again, let's continue the conversation. Email me. I would be honored to hit on those on our next broadcast. And I truly hope that you have a fantastic day. Thanks for tuning in. I'm truly humbled to have friends like you.
The views and opinions expressed during our broadcasts are solely those of the broadcast producers, hosts, and/or guests, etc., and are not necessarily the views or opinions of the Travelog Network, its sponsors, or affiliates.